Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Most leaders believe that policies create control, but they actually only create intent because behavior follows a completely different set of rules. It follows friction, defaults, and the immediate pressure of work that needs to get done right now. That gap matters a lot more in Microsoft 365 than most teams want to admit. Your written policy can say one thing, while your actual environment quietly rewards speed, convenience, and local shortcuts. When Copilot arrives, it doesn't fix that gap, it scales it across your entire enterprise. In this episode, I want to show you why governance built on written policy is fragile by design and why your people are not the problem. We are going to look at how to move toward structural compliance across Purview, DLP, and Copilot. If your governance depends on memory and goodwill, AI will simply automate your existing weaknesses. The policy illusion. Why written governance feels safer than it is. Let me take one step back. A lot of governance programs feel stronger than they are because they are very visible to the organization. You have a policy document, a training slide deck, and an annual acknowledgement flow that everyone clicks through. There might even be a steering committee and a nice SharePoint page where all the standards are listed out clearly for everyone to see. From a management perspective, that feels like control, but from a systems perspective, it is often just theater. I don't mean that in a cynical way, but the evidence of governance is usually documentary rather than operational. We point to a PDF and say the rule exists, or we point to a policy review and claim the risk is covered. We point to a communication campaign and tell ourselves the people were informed. Yet none of that proves the intended behavior actually happened when the risk showed up. That is the illusion. Written governance gives leaders a feeling of order because it is legible and can be easily approved or filed for an audit. It creates a visible artifact that says we thought about this, and to be fair, that intent does matter. Documentation and audit trails are important, but documented intent is not the same thing as executed control. That distinction is everything. The real question is never whether you have a policy, but rather what happens in the system when a busy person is moving fast. When they are under pressure with incomplete context and just trying to finish their work, that is where governance either becomes real or collapses. This is exactly where leaders overestimate their safety. If the proof of your control is a policy acknowledgement from 9 months ago, you do not have active governance. If the proof of control is that users were told what to do in a training session, you lack operational enforcement. Even if the correct behavior is described somewhere in the tenant, that is still not the same as the environment producing that behavior reliably. Code works differently. Code executes the moment a condition is met, and it doesn't care whether the user is tired or forgot their training. It doesn't pause because the quarter-end deadline is close, it just runs. Policies don't run. They depend on interpretation, timing, and the person recognizing that this specific moment is when the policy applies. When leaders say they have a policy for something, they usually mean they have informed the people inside the system that they are expected to behave a certain way. That is not control, it is a request, and requests are weak architecture. Let me make that even clearer. If a policy says confidential information must be labeled before sharing, but the environment makes unlabeled sharing easy and fast, the system is sending two different signals. The written layer says to protect the data, but the operational layer says to move quickly. Most people will follow the layer that helps them finish the task, not because they are reckless, but because they are responding rationally to local system conditions. It's a system outcome. The thing most people miss is that written policy often works best as a social signal upward rather than a behavioral control downward. It reassures leadership and gives compliance teams a language to use, but if the system doesn't reinforce the behavior, the policy stays informational. It never becomes operational. In Microsoft 365, that gap gets exposed very quickly. The platform is active, sharing happens fast, and content moves across Teams, SharePoint, and Outlook constantly. Work is conversational and often improvised, which means decisions are made in the flow of work rather than during a policy review. If your governance only exists as words, it enters the process far too late. That's the trap. The policy creates a sense of safety precisely because it is visible and formal, but the actual environment may still be rewarding bypass behavior all day long. When that happens, the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just not aligned with what leadership thinks it's doing. And why is that? Because people are not violating logic, they are simply responding to design. Why policies are not code? Let's stay with that idea for a moment and make the distinction a bit sharper. Policies are not code because code produces a specific outcome the second defined conditions are met, but policy does not. A policy describes an intention and then hands the actual execution over to humans working inside a changing environment. That is a completely different control model. And why is that important? Because one model is deterministic, while the other is entirely interpretive. If a DLP rule is configured to block a file with sensitive information from leaving the environment, that control acts at the exact moment the behavior happens. But if a written policy simply says, please do not share sensitive information externally, the outcome depends on whether the person notices the sensitivity, remembers the rule, and interprets the context correctly under time pressure. That is a lot of dependency to stack onto a single human moment. From a system perspective, that's not just unrealistic, it's fragile. The single point of failure in this architecture is user memory, and memory is a terrible place to store control. Memory degrades under stress and speed, especially when the workflow is unclear or the exception path feels easier. When a person has taken the same shortcut 10 times before without any visible consequences, the control effectively disappears. So when organizations say, "we told people," they are usually describing a communication event rather than actual risk reduction. That difference matters because communication can support a control, but it can never be the control itself. This clicked for me when I started looking at governance language the same way I look at infrastructure. In the world of infrastructure, we don't say a backup exists just because we told an admin to remember to export a file every Friday. We don't call that resilience. We call it a manual dependency that is guaranteed to fail eventually. We know it will fail not because the admin is careless, but because the architecture relies on a human remembering a repetitive task in a live environment. Yet in the world of governance, teams do this all the time. We write a policy, we publish it, we train people on it, and we have them acknowledge it. Then we act surprised when the outcome varies by person, by team, or by the pressure of a looming deadline. But variability is exactly what policy introduces into a system, because policy has to travel through a layer of ambiguity before it ever becomes behavior. Take something simple like a document classification policy. It sounds clear until real work shows up and people have to decide what counts as appropriate or when a rough draft officially becomes sensitive. Does internal financial planning need a higher label before the first review or only before final distribution? What happens when someone is using Outlook on mobile and forwarding a file quickly between meetings? Code doesn't ask those questions once it is defined, but people do, and they answer them differently every single time. That is why policies degrade. They don't fail because they are wrong. They fail because they pass through local interpretation, habits, and environmental pressure. Every extra sentence added to a policy might improve the legal precision, but it also increases the cognitive load at the point of action. The organization feels safer because the document is complete, while the operating model becomes more fragile because the decision burden on the user is heavier. That's the paradox. More detail often leads to less reliability. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember that a policy is a statement of intent, while code is an execution mechanism. Confusing the two creates a sense of false confidence that is incredibly expensive. Once leadership believes the rule itself is the control, they stop asking whether the environment actually enforces that intent. They assume the risk is handled because the language exists, even while the real system is being shaped by defaults, permissions, and workflow pressure. Policies matter because they set direction and define boundaries for audit and accountability. But they are not self-executing, and they cannot close the gap between intent and action on their own. They need structural compensation like defaults, automation, and permission design to function. Otherwise, your governance is just a document with a human dependency chain attached to it, and every single link in that chain is a potential point of failure. Once we see that clearly, the next question becomes obvious. What is actually driving behavior inside your environment? Dynamic systems break static rules. Now we have to ask the harder question. Even if a policy were written perfectly, what happens when the environment it governs keeps changing underneath it? This is where most Microsoft 365 governance models start to crack. It's not because the people are careless or the policies are useless, but because the operating environment is dynamic while the control logic remains static. That mismatch creates a phenomenon called drift. Microsoft 365 is not a fixed platform where things stay put. New features arrive, interfaces change, and defaults shift without warning. Copilot introduces entirely new entry points into your content, while permissions evolve through the natural course of daily collaboration. Teams are created, archived, and forgotten, and SharePoint structures expand until the written policy is left standing exactly where it was the day it was approved. The document remains stable, but the system does not. And why is that important? A static rule set assumes a stable environment where the path between intention and execution stays the same over time. In Microsoft 365, that assumption breaks quickly because what was low risk 6 months ago might now be exposed through a brand new workflow. What used to be a manual process is now accelerated by AI, and what once required 3 deliberate actions might now happen through a single click or an inherited permission. The policy might still read correctly on paper, but the system behavior it was meant to shape has already moved on. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see in governance programs today. Governance is treated like a rollout artifact or a one-time project where you define the rules, configure the basics, and move on. But the platform keeps moving after the project ends, which means your controls begin aging the moment you declare them complete. That isn't a policy problem, it's an operating model problem. If your environment changes weekly, but your governance only changes annually, your control layer will always be lagging behind reality. Once that gap opens, people start compensating locally to keep work moving. They don't wait for a governance committee to catch up. They find workarounds. That's when the platform starts generating unofficial behaviors and access patterns that nobody intended. It's not happening because there is no policy, but because the policy is no longer synchronized with the environment where actual decisions are being made. Most leaders already understand the concept of drift in infrastructure. They know about configuration drift and identity drift, where the environment slowly moves away from the original standard until risk accumulates quietly in the background. Governance drift works the same way. A compliant design at launch can become an exposed design over time without anyone making a dramatic mistake. Small changes stack up: new teams, new owners, new integrations, and new AI workflows. Eventually, the original policy is still technically present, but it is functionally disconnected from the daily work of the organization. It's still there, but it's no longer governing. That's why static governance is such a weak match for a platform like Microsoft 365. The system behaves more like a living control plane than a finished application, so it requires constant observation and recalibration. Governance needs to act more like product management and less like document management. A living environment needs living controls. That means you don't just define what should happen, you monitor what is actually happening. You don't just publish a standard and walk away, you review where behavior has moved. You can't assume yesterday's safe path is still safe today, especially once AI starts traversing your content and permissions at high speed. Copilot doesn't necessarily create this problem, but it certainly reveals and amplifies it. It makes latent drift visible. Messy permissions become more consequential, weak labeling becomes more obvious, and poor information architecture becomes impossible to ignore. If your governance is still based on a static rulebook in a dynamic environment, that rulebook is just structural compensation for a moving target. And structural compensation is always a warning sign that the official design is no longer carrying the load. But even if the platform never changed at all, there would still be a deeper force shaping your outcomes. People do not optimize for policy, they optimize for speed. People optimize for speed, not policy. Leaders often push back on this next point because it sounds like we're lowering our standards, but that isn't the case at all. We are simply describing the business reality of how work actually happens. Most people using Microsoft 365 don't wake up planning to violate a governance policy or find clever ways to break the rules. They are just trying to answer a client, send an update, or move a project forward before their next meeting starts and the day disappears. The local objective for the person doing the work is usually very simple: finish the task. When the system forces a choice between the fast path and the compliant path, people don't see it as a moral crossroads. They experience it as workflow friction, where one way feels smooth and the other feels slow, uncertain, or socially awkward. Because they need to keep things moving, they choose the path that preserves their momentum. This isn't a sign of bad intent, it's a sign of optimization. Human beings respond to immediate rewards much more reliably than they respond to abstract policy goals. A deadline hitting today will always beat a governance principle explained 3 months ago, and a clear button will always beat a confusing process. If a user can't see the risk directly in the moment, a fast share link will beat a complicated permission model every single time. When we say people optimize for speed, we really mean they optimize for what the environment rewards right now. Most corporate environments reward progress instead of compliance, which creates a natural conflict for the user. Think about how compliance friction actually feels when you're in the middle of a busy workday. It rarely announces itself as governance and instead shows up as a series of frustrations. You feel it as a delay, a moment of uncertainty, or a few extra clicks that shouldn't be there. It looks like unclear labels and the fear of choosing the wrong option, which often leads to the small embarrassment of having to ask where a file should live for the third time. That last part matters more than most teams realize, because people don't just avoid friction to save time. They avoid it because it creates doubt. And doubt is an expensive luxury when everyone else in the organization seems to be moving at full speed. If the compliant path makes a person hesitate while the workaround keeps them moving, the workaround becomes the only rational choice. This is where our language about bad behavior starts to fail us. What looks like non-compliance from the executive level often feels like high throughput from the desk level. A person might export data into Excel because the official reporting tool is too slow, or a team might share a broad access link because they can't wait for a formal ownership decision. Someone else might copy content directly into a chat because the approved repository is too hard to navigate. None of these choices feel like an act of rebellion in the moment. They just feel like getting the job done. It's a system outcome, and once you see it that way, blaming the individual becomes much less useful than analyzing the design. You might think that people still have a personal responsibility to follow the rules, and of course they do, but responsibility is not the same thing as control architecture. If your governance model assumes that busy people will repeatedly choose high friction over ease of use, your model is fundamentally weak. You are asking human discipline to compensate for poor environmental design. And that is a strategy that never scales. Many compliance programs actually create their own resistance by interpreting a bypass as a training issue. They respond with more reminders, more documentation, and more annual education, but none of that removes the underlying pressure. If the approved path is still harder or more confusing, these interventions just add more cognitive load to an already stressed user. Cognitive load is exactly where compliance starts to break down because every extra decision is just another chance for inconsistency. Every judgment call creates an opening for drift. And every interruption gives someone a reason to say they'll just do the easy thing this one time. Eventually, just this once becomes the standard way of working. Once the normal behavior of your team diverges from the official policy, your governance is no longer shaping the environment. It's just commenting on it from the sidelines. We have to stop treating speed and compliance as if they are naturally aligned because in many digital environments they are not. The system makes one path easy and the other deliberate. So the easy path wins by default. If you want compliant behavior, you have to make it operationally efficient rather than just making it better documented. It shouldn't be about being morally superior or using more strongly worded warnings. It needs to be faster, clearer, and safer for the person using it. The people inside your system will always follow the path that lets the work move. If your governance cannot survive that basic truth, then it isn't really governance yet. It's just policy language waiting to be bypassed. The psychology of compliance fatigue. Now, map that same pressure to the actual emotional experience of trying to stay compliant. Governance is often misunderstood because leaders read a lack of compliance as a lack of discipline. In reality, a lot of what they are seeing is just fatigue. It's the result of decision fatigue and the simple fact that people are tired of being interrupted when they are trying to move their work forward. The human response to friction is never neutral. When a system says no in the middle of a task, it rarely feels like a helpful safety mechanism to the person doing the work. It feels like resistance and delay, and it often feels personal even if the control itself makes perfect sense on paper. The user isn't thinking about how a governance boundary has appeared at the correct policy checkpoint. They are wondering why the system is making their job harder again. That emotional shift is a big deal because once compliance is linked to interruption, people stop seeing it as a support system. They start seeing it as an obstruction, and that changes the entire relationship between the user and the organization. Instead of asking for guidance early in a project, they wait until the very last minute. Instead of using the governed path, they start testing the edges to see what they can get away with. They stop collaborating with the compliance team and start trying to avoid triggering them altogether. This isn't rebellion, it's just learned behavior inside a high-friction environment. Most people miss the fact that fatigue doesn't start the moment a rule is broken. It starts much earlier when the system forces a person to make dozens of small, repetitive, low-context decisions. You have to choose a label, confirm a warning, re-evaluate an attachment, and interpret a policy tip. You have to decide if content is sensitive and if the storage location is correct over and over again. Each of these decisions might look small on its own, but when you stack them across an entire workday, they become a heavy load. That load changes how people behave. Once someone feels overloaded, they stop processing information carefully and start routing their actions automatically. They click past warnings and choose the most familiar options because the system has asked them to care in too many places at once. This is the basic mechanics of compliance fatigue: too many interruptions, too little context, and too much ambiguity at the point of action. When you add repetitive warnings that don't feel relevant, you create a state of alert blindness. If the environment keeps showing vague or badly timed alerts, people learn to treat the message as background noise. The warning loses its meaning, and while the control is still there, it no longer has any impact on behavior. From a system perspective, that is a failed feedback loop. The environment is trying to speak, but the signal has been drowned out by the noise. When this happens, organizations usually respond by increasing the volume with more banners and more mandatory training. If the underlying experience is still unclear, they have only succeeded in multiplying the emotional burden on their staff. The system continues to demand vigilance without doing anything to reduce the actual uncertainty. This is why framing compliance as policing always creates distance between the users and the leaders. People won't bring forward difficult cases if they expect to be met with friction. They won't ask for help if they think help will just lead to a delay, and they won't offer feedback to improve the system if they assume the answer will always be no. The relationship becomes adversarial because of how it's structured, even if that wasn't the original intent. However, there is a better way to think about this. Compliance can act as a form of guidance instead of a form of rejection. A well-designed control doesn't just stop a risky action, it explains the issue in context and offers a safer route. By reducing the number of decisions a user has to make alone, you change the psychology of the entire process. The control starts to feel less like a gatekeeper and more like a navigation tool. This is a completely different operating model that leads to much better results. When people feel guided, they are much more likely to cooperate early in the process. When they feel judged, they tend to compensate privately, and once that private compensation becomes the norm, governance loses all visibility. This isn't just about how users feel, It has direct structural implications for the business. Alert blindness leads to weaker interventions, and decision fatigue leads to lower accuracy across the board. Adversarial compliance means you have less transparency into what is actually happening. In other words, the emotional burden you place on your people eventually becomes a major operational risk. If people are constantly rooting around the official path, that behavior is a clear signal about the environment you've built. Digital desire paths inside Microsoft 365. And this is where the concept of desire paths becomes incredibly useful for understanding how people actually work. In the physical world, a desire path is that dirt trail people wear into the grass because the official sidewalk takes too long or bends the wrong way. People essentially vote with their feet, showing you the route that makes sense in real life rather than the one the architect drew on a blueprint. The same thing happens inside Microsoft 365, only in this environment, the grass is digital. A desire path appears when your team repeatedly bypasses a designed workflow because that official process adds friction at exactly the wrong moment. They export a list into Excel instead of staying in the structured system, or perhaps they save files locally and upload them later to avoid a slow interface. They might share a broad anyone with the link access point because the official permission settings are too slow to navigate during a deadline. They use personal notes, side chats, or unmanaged tools because the official location feels harder to use than the unofficial one. If you look closely at these behaviors, you'll realize they aren't just random acts of rebellion. They are patterns. These workarounds happen often enough to become the new normal. And that means the system is trying to tell you something important. Most governance teams see these moments only as policy violations, but that perspective is far too shallow to be useful. A repeated workaround is actually a piece of design feedback that tells you exactly where the environment is misaligned with the actual work. It shows you where your official path looks perfectly compliant on a slide deck but feels completely broken in practice. That distinction matters for the health of your organization. When a team keeps exporting data into Excel, the lesson isn't automatically that those people are being reckless with company information. The real lesson might be that the reporting tools inside your governed environment are too rigid or too slow for the fast-paced decisions they need to make. If people keep oversharing links in SharePoint or Teams, it certainly creates a security risk, but it also suggests your approved sharing model doesn't match the pace of modern collaboration. The thing most leaders miss is that these desire paths reveal reality much faster than any annual policy review ever could. A policy review tells you what leadership intended to happen, while a desire path shows you what the environment actually produces. That second insight is much more valuable if your goal is building structural resilience. Now, map that logic to the daily behavior you see in Microsoft 365. A project team might start a conversation in a public channel, but the key decisions quickly move into private chats because the channel structure feels too formal or slow. Business units might store their working drafts in OneDrive even though the final versions belong in SharePoint, simply because they don't trust the shared library setup yet. Someone might copy sensitive content directly into an email thread because the recipient can't get clean access to the source file quickly enough to stay productive. A finance lead might keep a shadow spreadsheet outside the main process because the governed workflow can't support the specific reporting cadence their department requires. Those are all desire paths, and while they aren't necessarily good or harmless, they are very real. Real paths deserve your attention. Once a workaround becomes a repeated behavior, it stops being an exception and becomes an unofficial operating model for that department. This is the exact moment when governance should get curious rather than just getting frustrated. You have to ask what that person is actually trying to achieve and where the friction is coming from. You need to identify which specific decision or delay the system is imposing on them. Is this a harmful path that we truly need to block, or is it a useful signal that we need to pave and make official? That last question is the one that defines your strategy. Not every desire path should become the new standard because some routes are genuinely dangerous and need to be shut down immediately. Broad external sharing of sensitive data isn't an innovation signal, it's a massive risk path that requires a hard stop. However, other workarounds contain the perfect blueprint for a better system design. They expose hidden workflow requirements, missing defaults, or governance patterns that were optimized for the language of control instead of the reality of business. This is where mature governance starts to separate itself from fragile governance. Fragile governance blames the people for leaving the path, while resilient governance studies the path the people keep choosing. If enough people keep walking across the grass, the problem usually isn't a lack of discipline. The problem is the sidewalk. Before we jump into adding more controls or design levers, we need to treat these workarounds as vital telemetry. They are behavioral evidence showing us where the official route is misaligned with the job the people inside the system are trying to do. Once you see that clearly, the next move becomes obvious. Stop starting with blame and start reading the workaround like an architectural signal. What workarounds are really telling you? So let's push that idea one level deeper into the system logic. A workaround is never just a broken rule. It is a message from the front lines of your business. It is the system telling you through behavior that something important is missing from the official infrastructure. When I see spreadsheet hotspots in a business area, I don't start by attacking the spreadsheet itself. I start by looking for the unmet requirement hiding behind it. Why did this team feel the need to build parallel logic outside the governed platform? What did Excel give them that the official process lacked? Usually, the answer is a combination of speed, flexibility, visibility, or simple control over their own timing. That matters because the workaround often contains a set of highly refined requirements. The people using that workaround have already tested the path and discovered the exceptions that the architects missed. They've exposed the gaps and built the specific sequence that helps them survive the workflow as it actually exists, not as it was imagined during a governance workshop. This means the unofficial path is often a blueprint for what the system should have been. It might not always be a safe blueprint, but it is almost always a very honest one. Take the issue of overused shared folders as an example. If one specific location keeps becoming a dumping ground for documents and drafts, it usually points to a weakness in your information architecture. Maybe the official SharePoint structure is too fragmented for cross-team work, or perhaps the navigation is so slow that nobody trusts where the final version should live. In that case, the shared folder becomes structural compensation for all that uncertainty. The same logic applies to side-channel messaging. If decisions keep moving into private chats or informal email threads, the issue is rarely just a lack of user discipline. More often, the official collaboration space is failing at speed, clarity, or psychological safety. People move to side channels when the approved channel feels too exposed, too noisy, or too cumbersome for the quick coordination they need in the moment. That behavior creates risk, but it also reveals a fundamental design failure in the official workspace. This becomes even more relevant when we look at how people are using unmanaged AI tools today. If people are pasting company content into tools outside your governed environment, the first question shouldn't be how to stop them. The better question is to ask, what need inside the official environment is currently going unmet? Are they looking for faster summarization, better drafting help, or more useful search across their messy content? If that need remains unserved, banning the behavior without redesigning the path usually just pushes the activity further into the dark. That is the consistent pattern we see in every system. The workaround shows you exactly where your intent and your environment have drifted apart. Because of this, mature governance requires a more precise response than simple prohibition. It requires a process of triage. Some paths need to be blocked, some need to be redirected, and some need to be paved. Blocking a path is for behaviors that are inherently dangerous, like putting sensitive data in personal storage or using unrestricted access links. Those aren't innovation signals, they are exposure paths that threaten the entire organization. Redirecting a path is for when the need is valid but the route is wrong. If people are exporting data because the reporting view is weak, governance shouldn't just say no. It should offer a better, more integrated route that solves the original problem. Paving a path is when the behavior itself reveals a superior design. The people have already shown you the shortest, most useful route to the goal. Your job is to bring that path back inside the governed environment by providing stronger defaults and safer controls. This is where the maturity of your governance model really changes. Immature governance reads behavior as disobedience, but mature governance reads that same behavior as telemetry. That doesn't mean you approve every workaround you find. It means you investigate every repeated workaround for what it reveals about the business reality. If the same bypass keeps appearing in different departments, that isn't noise, that is a pattern, and a pattern is data you can use to improve the system. When you audit your Microsoft 365 environment, don't just look for policy violations, look for behavioral clusters. Find where files are constantly being exported and where broad links are being overused. Look for where private channels are carrying the weight of public process work and where teams keep rebuilding the same local workarounds. That is where the environment is speaking to you most clearly. Once you start listening that way, the entire conversation changes. You stop asking why people won't follow the rules and you start asking what this behavior is telling you about the path you designed. Which brings me to the real divide underneath all of this. It isn't a choice between being compliant or non-compliant. It's the difference between fragile governance and structural resilience. Fragile governance versus structural resilience. So let's name the difference clearly. Fragile governance is a system that depends on people getting too many things right too often while they are under normal business pressure. It is a model that assumes perfection. Structural resilience is different because it assumes people will be busy, distracted, and sometimes unclear about the rules. Instead of fighting that reality, it designs the environment so those normal human conditions do not immediately turn into a security exposure. That is a very different philosophy. Fragile governance says, here is the rule, now make sure you remember it. Resilient governance says, here is the environment, and it carries the rule for you. And why is that important? The reason is that most Microsoft 365 governance still leans on human vigilance as its primary control layer. We ask people to remember to classify the file, remember not to overshare the link, and remember which team is the right one for this specific project. We expect them to know what Copilot should see, which sites have the correct permissions, and how the exception process works for every single task. That is not resilience. That is just accumulated cognitive debt. The system is asking a person to act as the enforcement engine, and once that happens, every missed step becomes a potential breach path. When a user forgets one label or misses one inherited permission during a rushed share action, the whole control model starts to buckle under the load. From a system perspective, that is a single point of failure repeated across your entire digital estate. Now compare that with resilient governance. Resilient governance starts with defaults, uses redundancy to catch errors, and automates the most obvious protections before a risk can scale. It applies context-aware controls at the exact moment an action happens, which ultimately reduces the number of decisions a person has to make correctly to stay safe. That is the deep shift we need. The goal here is not to create better rule followers. The goal is to create fewer risky decision points. If a document is classified by default, the user does not need to remember that first control step, and the system handles the heavy lifting. When a DLP policy can distinguish between a simple warning and a hard stop, it shapes behavior without turning every minor event into a frustrating dead end. If Copilot only operates across content that is already trusted and labeled, then the AI is not relying on policy interpretation, it is relying on governed context. That is structural resilience. And this is why I keep coming back to the idea of load-bearing design. In a fragile model, the policy document is load-bearing, the training is load-bearing, and the user's memory is the only thing keeping the data safe. We are essentially building a system where the hope that people will pause and choose correctly is the only thing holding the structure up. In a resilient model, the environment carries more of the weight. Labels carry meaning into downstream behavior, permissions contain reach before content is ever surfaced, and DLP intervenes at the point of action. Guardrails shape what the AI can access and amplify, which means the infrastructure itself is doing the work of protecting the organization. Now, none of this means policy disappears. It still matters because policy defines intent, gives us legal language, and explains why a specific boundary exists in the first place. But policy should not be the thing holding the whole structure up. It should describe the control logic while the environment executes it. That's the redesign. And this is where a lot of organizations get stuck because they think resilience means softer governance, but it actually means the opposite. It usually results in stronger governance that is moved closer to the act itself, creating less dependence on awareness and more dependence on intentional design. Actually, if you want a simple test for whether your governance is fragile, just ask yourself one question. How many times does this control rely on a person noticing, remembering, and choosing correctly in real time? If the answer is often, you do not have a resilient control, you have a human-dependent control that will eventually fail. These controls fail quietly for a long time until the scale of the organization finally exposes the cracks. Copilot makes that reality painfully visible. Because AI doesn't introduce discipline where none exists, it simply consumes whatever structure is already there and amplifies it. Good structure becomes immediate leverage for the business, but weak structure quickly becomes a multiplied risk that is hard to contain. So the real maturity shift is this. Stop designing governance as a set of instructions. Start designing it as behavioral infrastructure. Because structural resilience is not about making people perfect. It is about making the environment tolerant of normal human behavior without collapsing. And if we want that kind of resilience, we need a better design principle than rules alone. We need pavement. The pavement concept, make the right path, the easy path. So let's talk about pavement. If desire paths show us where people actually need to go, then pavement is our design response to that data. It means we stop pretending the official route is correct just because we wrote it down, and we start shaping the environment around the paths that people can actually sustain. That is a very different mindset from traditional governance. Traditional governance often says, this is the approved process, now please comply with it, regardless of how much friction that creates. Pavement says if the approved process keeps losing to a workaround, then the design is incomplete and needs to change. And why is that important? The fastest way to reduce risky behavior is not always to warn against it, but to make the safer behavior require much less effort. When we reduce the need for interpretation and manual judgment at the point of action, we make it easier for people to do the right thing by default. That's what paving the desire path really means inside Microsoft 365. You study the repeated behavior, identify the real need behind it, and then you formalize the safe version of that behavior into the environment itself. So instead of teaching people not to export data, you ask why the governed workflow failed to support their job in the first place. Instead of sending another reminder about sharing discipline, you redesign the sharing path so the right choice is both clearer and faster for the user. Instead of relying on people to remember classification every single time, you move that classification closer to automatic behavior. This is not weaker governance, it is governance moved closer to reality. And that matters because invisible control usually outperforms visible instruction every single day. A visible instruction still asks the user to stop and choose, but an embedded control removes that burden by narrowing the path before a risky decision is even made. The thing most people miss is that good governance should often feel boring. It shouldn't be dramatic, it shouldn't be highly visible, and it definitely shouldn't feel emotionally heavy for the end user. If the system is well paved, people don't spend their day thinking about compliance because they are working inside an environment where the safe path is natural. The right team gets created with the right defaults, the document lands in the right place, and the label is already present or strongly suggested. The risky action gets interrupted with helpful context rather than a mystery error message, and the AI works inside trusted boundaries instead of wandering through messy access sprawl. That is what mature governance feels like. It is quiet, it is consistent, and it is load-bearing. Now, you might be thinking, doesn't that make people less aware of the risks? Not necessarily. It simply makes them less responsible for carrying the full weight of the control model in their head at all times. That's a good thing, because awareness should support the system, not substitute for it. And if your whole program depends on awareness campaigns, you are placing too much weight on human memory. Pavement reduces that dependence by making the intended behavior structurally convenient for everyone involved. And this is where the business value becomes very practical. When the right path is easier, three things happen. First, adoption improves because people stop fighting the environment. And second, risk drops because fewer actions depend on perfect human judgment. Third, governance becomes more scalable because it is enforced through defaults and context rather than constant manual supervision. That is structural resilience in action. And there's another benefit leaders often underestimate. Paved paths create much better telemetry for the IT team. When the safe route is clear and efficient, the remaining workarounds become much more meaningful because they no longer just reflect general friction. They point to specific places where the design still does not match the reality of the work, which makes the system easier to improve over time. So pavement is not the removal of control, it is the operationalization of intent. It takes policy out of the abstract layer and brings it into the moment where behavior actually happens. That means better defaults, clearer information architecture, and safer permission boundaries that protect the business. It means adaptive interventions instead of generic warnings, and trusted AI boundaries instead of broad access and a hope for the best. If you remember nothing else from this part, remember this. The right path does not win because it is morally correct. It wins because it is easier to take under normal pressure. That is the design standard. And once you accept that, the conversation changes again, and you stop asking how to make people try harder. You start asking where the environment still makes the wrong move feel easier than the right one. So let's get concrete and look at the first pavement layer. Pavement lever 1, sensitivity labels as automatic behavior. The first layer of pavement we need to lay down is sensitivity labels. I want to be very precise about this because most organizations are still getting it wrong. They treat labels as a user education feature, a drop-down menu, a little prompt, or a thing they hope employees will remember when a document feels important. But that mindset is a mistake. It keeps labels in the realm of instructions when they actually need to be part of your infrastructure. In the environment we're working in today, a simple reminder isn't enough. A label shouldn't just be a sticky note on a file. It needs to be a structural control. The real power of a sensitivity label isn't the text sitting at the top of a document, but rather the entire chain of events that decision triggers downstream. We're talking about sharing permissions, encryption protocols, access boundaries, and retention rules. These are the signals the system uses to understand how to handle that specific piece of content. When you make labeling optional in practice, you're essentially making every single one of those downstream security controls optional too. That is where the risk lives. If your users have to stop and decide on a classification every single time they work, your governance is already under a heavy load. The system is asking for a complex judgment call at the exact second a person is trying to finish a task and move on. We all know how that ends. Speed wins, ambiguity wins, and the default blank state wins every time. So the first design move is actually very simple. You have to remove the blank state wherever possible. By using default labels, you narrow the decision space for the user. If the vast majority of your everyday content starts as general, then set the system to start there. Don't ask people to build the baseline manually from scratch every morning. If a specific library, site, or workflow is clearly part of a sensitive project, carry that context into the default behavior so the person doesn't have to rebuild the meaning every time they hit save. That is what real pavement looks like in a digital system. The label stops being a test of how diligent a user is and starts becoming a natural part of the environment itself. Once you nail that transition, everything else in the stack starts to click into place. Labels aren't just for classification, they are the bridge between what you intend to happen and what the system actually enforces. They turn broad, abstract governance language into machine-readable instructions that the rest of Microsoft 365 can actually execute. This includes your data loss prevention and your protection behaviors. It also absolutely includes how Copilot understands context. If your content is unlabeled or inconsistently tagged, the rest of your control model is essentially flying blind. The system can't see clearly, the AI can't see clearly, and your governance becomes little more than guesswork wrapped in fancy policy language. Now, while default labeling is a huge part of this, the next layer is auto-labeling. This is where the system starts carrying the heavy lifting for the human. Current research into Microsoft's approach shows that Copilot governance is strictly label first, with auto-labeling available for Office files and PDFs. Even though there are still some format gaps to close, the practical direction is clear. We need to move classification upstream. The goal is to make security less dependent on a human's manual attention span. It won't be perfect, but it will be material. When obvious sensitive patterns trigger a label automatically, a single missed human decision doesn't immediately turn into a silent exposure path. The control gains redundancy, and as we know, redundancy is the foundation of any resilient system design. Of course, we have to be realistic because auto-labeling isn't a magic wand. It can create false positives. It depends entirely on your coverage. And if your original taxonomy is a mess, automation will just scale that confusion. The goal isn't to automate every single thing blindly. Instead, the goal is to reduce the number of times a user has to make a high-consequence decision without any support from the system. That is a much higher design standard to aim for. Let's look at how this works in the real world. Imagine two different environments. In the first one, a finance manager is drafting a quarterly report. She sees no default label and ignores the drop-down because her meeting starts in 2 minutes. She shares it internally, and later, someone else forwards it to an external partner without realizing the security chain was never pulled. In the second environment, that same file starts with a default classification tied to the workspace. If the system detects sensitive financial patterns, it applies a stronger label automatically. Now, the content enters the system with its context already attached. Sharing is shaped differently, protection behavior changes, and the room for an accidental leak gets much smaller. It's the same person, but a different architecture leads to a completely different outcome. That is the entire point. Sensitivity labels work best when they stop being a reminder people have to remember and start being an automatic behavior the environment provides. When classification is embedded at the point of creation, governance stops chasing the file downstream and starts shaping it at the source. This matters even more because our next layer of pavement acts the very moment that risk turns into action. Pavement lever 2, DLP as adaptive enforcement. Labels are a great start, but they aren't enough on their own. If labels give the system meaning, then data loss prevention, or DLP, gives the system timing. Timing is everything because governance usually fails the moment an action happens, not the moment the policy was written. A document sitting quietly in a folder isn't a risk. The risk is the send, the share, the copy-paste, or the upload. That is the exact moment the environment has to respond. I don't think of DLP as an audit layer. I think of it as behavioral enforcement in motion. When it's used poorly, DLP feels like a punishment. A hard block pops up after the user has already committed to the action, the context is weak, and frustration spikes. The person learns very quickly that the system is just an obstacle to their job. That version of DLP might stop some risks, but it also forces people to find workarounds. When it's used well, DLP reads the room. It matches the response to the actual level of risk involved. It guides the person toward a safer path before they feel like a workaround is their only option to get the work done. That distinction changes everything. Not every risky action deserves the same heavy-handed reaction. If there is a high-confidence attempt to move sensitive data outside the company, you need a hard block. There's no debate or coaching needed there. The control should simply hold the line. But a medium-risk action is a different story. Maybe the content is sensitive, but the context is a bit fuzzy. Maybe a user is doing their job, but chose a sharing option that's a little too broad. In those cases, a nudge is much more effective than a brick wall. This is where adaptive enforcement becomes a powerful design concept. The system doesn't treat every mistake as a moral failure. It treats the event as a behavioral moment. Then it decides whether to explain the risk, slow the user down, redirect them, or stop them entirely. This is how resilient systems actually function. Microsoft Purview policy tips are already doing this by showing inline notifications and warnings when content matches a DLP condition. In a Copilot environment, sensitive content can be excluded from the AI's grounding while still leaving a link for the human to access it manually. This is a vital pattern because the system isn't just saying no, it is preserving a safe route for the work to continue. That is guidance, and guidance changes behavior in a way that policing never will. When a user sees a policy tip explaining why an action is risky and what the safer alternative is, the control becomes legible. It feels less like an arbitrary rule and more like a helpful guardrail. The person can still move forward, just not through the most dangerous path, which lowers frustration and increases cooperation. The thing most people miss is that good DLP shouldn't just stop data from leaving. It should teach the environment how to shape future behavior. If you see the same medium risk pattern popping up over and over, that isn't just a user problem. It's a signal that your workflow is inviting the wrong move too late in the process. In this way, DLP becomes your telemetry. If one team or one specific process is hitting constant hard blocks, That's a sign of misaligned design. The control is firing at the very end because the safe path was never made easy at the beginning. That is a massive insight for any leader. Too many blocks usually mean the system is asking people to discover compliance only when the risk is already happening. Balanced nudging is different. It means the environment is shaping behavior earlier with less friction and more context. If labels are the first layer of pavement because they attach meaning to your data, then DLP is the second layer because it steps in when that data is about to move the wrong way. This becomes even more critical once AI enters your workflow. Now, the question isn't just about what people are sharing, it's about what the system can see, what it can infer, and what it can amplify from the structure you've already built. If you audited your data governance the same way you audit your technical infrastructure, what would you find? Is your system designed to support the people inside it, or is it just waiting for them to make a mistake? Pavement lever 3, Copilot guardrails and context control. Now we move into the third layer of the pavement, and this is where those high-level governance conversations finally start to feel real. The first thing you have to understand is that Copilot does not read your policy library, it doesn't attend your mandatory awareness training, and it certainly doesn't care what your PDF says about handling confidential data. AI works from permissions, labels, and the actual boundaries the environment enforces in real time. When leaders ask me if Copilot follows policy, I tell them they are asking the wrong question. The better question is simple: what kind of system did we give Copilot to operate inside? Because AI doesn't follow your written policies, it follows the system you actually built. This distinction matters more than ever because Copilot isn't some separate world living in a vacuum. It traverses the exact same Microsoft 365 reality your people live in every day, which means SharePoint permissions, Teams access, and OneDrive sprawl all become part of the context. All of that data shapes what Copilot can see and what it can return to a user. If your structure is clean, Copilot becomes a useful tool inside trusted boundaries. But if that structure is messy, the AI just scales the mess at a speed you can't track. This is why I focus so much on the concept of context control. We spend a lot of time talking about prompt engineering and adoption use cases, and while those things matter, there is a more basic design truth underneath them. Output quality depends entirely on input governance. When you put governed data in, you get safer output out, but weak governance leads to noisy and risky results every single time. This isn't just an abstract theory. Your research context is very clear on this point because Purview DLP for Microsoft 365 Copilot can actually exclude sensitive content from AI grounding while still leaving a reference link for manual access. That is a powerful pattern to follow. The system isn't trying to teach the AI your policy document, it is simply restricting what the AI can use based on structural signals. That is the exact model leaders need to grasp. You do not govern Copilot by writing better rules for your users, you govern it by tightening the context layer. That means you fix permissions first, then you move to labels, and finally you set up the DLP controls that shape what the AI can process during an interaction. If a person has broad access they shouldn't have, Copilot makes that access more visible and much more consequential. When sensitive files sit in permissive locations, the AI doesn't create the underlying problem, but it does compress the distance between a hidden risk and a visible exposure. If your naming is unclear or your versions are duplicated, Copilot might still return an answer, but your trust in that answer drops because the relevance isn't there. This is why low trust in Copilot is almost always a governance problem before it is ever an AI problem. The system is doing exactly what it was allowed to do, it's just operating on a structure that was never designed for AI to move through at high speed. So what do real guardrails look like? They aren't slogans or vague statements about responsible AI. Real guardrails mean clean permission boundaries, strong label coverage, and structured content locations. You need DLP controls for sensitive interactions and a clear separation between your governed and ungoverned zones. That is how you create an AI-safe operating space. Once you build that foundation, Copilot becomes much easier to trust because it's no longer reaching through a chaotic information estate and hoping for the best. Most organizations still invert the sequence by starting with Copilot excitement and then adding policy language later. They eventually discover the estate underneath is over-permissioned and full of ambiguous content, and at that point, governance just becomes a way to compensate for bad structure. Teams try to explain away a broken architecture with more caution statements, but that won't hold up over time. Copilot amplifies what already exists in your environment. Good structure becomes leverage, but bad structure becomes multiplied uncertainty. If you want real guardrails, start by asking what this AI can see because the environment allows it, not because your policy intends it. That gap is your real risk surface, but it is also your biggest redesign opportunity. Once you tighten context control, Copilot changes character entirely. It stops feeling like a risky black box sitting on top of your tenant and starts behaving like a governed interface into trusted information. That is a massive shift in business reality, which is why this next example is so important. Let me show you what happens when the policy exists, but the structure fails to support it. The confidential email, that wasn't a structural failure case. Let's make this concrete with a case that captures the entire argument. Imagine an executive is preparing a sensitive financial update, which is the kind of message that happens every day in any real organization. It contains early numbers and internal assumptions that clearly should be treated with a high level of care. The policy is already there, and it says this content must be marked confidential before it moves through normal channels. On paper, that sounds like a solid plan. You have a clear instruction, a clear intent, and a clear line of responsibility. But if you look closer, you'll see that the control actually depends on the sender recognizing the sensitivity in the moment and remembering the right label. It requires them to apply that label correctly while under pressure, and it assumes no one downstream will mistake the message for a normal email. That is not a resilient control, it is just a human checkpoint dressed up to look like governance. In this scenario, the executive is moving fast between meetings and revisions. The message gets written and sent, but the label is never applied. Maybe they missed it or maybe they just forgot, but the exact reason matters much less than the architecture behind the mistake. Because the message leaves without that protection context attached, the environment treats it like ordinary mail. It can be forwarded, copied into other threads, and moved through the organization without any of the controls that were supposed to activate. Because nothing in the structure corrected the missing action, the error stays invisible, and everyone downstream interacts with the message as if it belongs on the default path. This is how a single missed decision turns into a large risk path. Eventually, the message reaches people it was never meant to see, and once it gets close to external exposure, legal and compliance teams suddenly get involved. The organization is now facing a near-breach situation, and the first thing leadership asks is why the policy wasn't followed. But that isn't the deepest failure here. The real failure is that the entire protection model depended on one person performing one manual act at one specific moment with no structural backup. The policy and the intention were both there, but the resilient execution was missing. The policy worked perfectly on paper, but the system didn't enforce it. This is why I say policies are not code, because code would have checked the condition and triggered the outcome automatically. In this case, the policy relied on memory and judgment under pressure, which means the true control wasn't the policy at all. It was the user's limited attention.
That is a single point of failure.
Now imagine that same scenario in a better designed environment where the workspace carries a sensitive default context. The message starts with a baseline classification instead of a blank state, and the system uses relevant patterns to support stronger labeling automatically. Downstream controls for sharing and handling respond to that context in real time, making one missed moment much less catastrophic. You have the same executive and the same business pressure, but because you have a different architecture, you get a different outcome. That is the lesson leaders need to take away from this. When a sensitive email moves as ordinary mail, the issue isn't that people are careless, it's that governance was implemented as an instruction rather than infrastructure. When instructions fail under pressure, the business discovers the difference between declared control and actual control very quickly. This brings us to the next hidden multiplier of fragility. Even when policies exist and labels improve, bad permissions can still undermine everything you've built underneath. Over-permissioning, the hidden multiplier of fragility. Now we need to look at the infrastructure layer that most organizations underestimate for far too long, and that layer is permissions. If we think of policy as our intent and labels as our context, then permissions represent our reach. They determine what can be seen, what can be found, and what can be shared, which means they dictate exactly what every downstream control is trying to contain. When this layer is weak, every other part of the system has to work harder to compensate for that structural failure. That is why over-permissioning is such a dangerous multiplier in any environment. It doesn't always create an immediate headline-grabbing incident, but it silently expands the blast radius of every other design flaw you might have. A document sitting in the wrong place is a simple human error, but a document in the wrong place with broad inherited access is a systemic failure. We see this often with team sites that have unclear ownership, which starts as a governance problem but quickly turns into a massive scaling problem when member access is left loose. Once Copilot or enterprise search starts surfacing what was always technically visible, the organization suddenly feels a risk that was already there, just hidden by the fact that nobody knew how to find it. This is an uncomfortable truth for many leaders who claim that nobody accessed that content before. While that might be true from a governance perspective, past access is not the right test to run. The real question is whether they could have accessed it, because if the door was unlocked, the exposure already existed. AI didn't create the risk, it just removed the obscurity that had been masking the problem for years. And we have to be clear about one thing: obscurity is not a control. Over-permissioning is corrosive because it forces every other safeguard to work harder than it was ever designed to. Labels now have to compensate for access that was far too broad, and DLP systems have to intercept behaviors that should have been structurally limited much earlier in the process. Compliance teams end up spending their time explaining why users are seeing content they were never expected to notice. shifting the entire model from prevention to downstream correction. That is the definition of weak architecture, and weak architecture always gets exposed the moment the speed of the business increases. In Microsoft 365, this usually shows up in very ordinary, boring ways that people ignore. You see SharePoint sites created in a rush and never cleaned up, or teams with guests and members added over months without a single review. OneDrive links are shared broadly because they were convenient in the moment, and libraries end up with broken inheritance that nobody on the team fully understands anymore. Folders that started as quick access shortcuts years ago are now treated like normal operating infrastructure. While each of these feels like a local issue, together they produce a pattern where the system is more open than leadership thinks and less intentional than the policy language suggests. That gap matters even if you never touch AI, but with Copilot, the path from permission to exposure gets much shorter. Content that was technically available but practically buried can now become part of a summary or a suggestion, making the hidden structure visible to the wrong audience. Copilot does not create the over-permissioning, it simply operationalizes the mess you already had. I often tell leadership teams that AI doesn't follow your governance documents, it follows the estate you actually built. If you want to reduce fragility, permission design has to move from background administration to the very core of your governance architecture. This means least privilege cannot be a slogan. It has to be a design discipline. Ownership is not just an admin checkbox, it is a control boundary, and access reviews are not boring audit rituals but essential structural maintenance. Leaders need to stop taking comfort in the idea that people only accessed what they were allowed to. That sentence can describe a total governance failure if the allowance itself was the problem. The system outcome here is not accidental exposure, but exposure that was made predictable by design. To fix this, you have to treat permissions as the hidden infrastructure behind all organizational trust. You must audit broad and inherited access before the consequences become obvious. And you need to clean up ownership logic where sensitive content actually moves. Once permissions are messy, every other control starts carrying weight it was never meant to carry. And systems that depend on constant structural compensation never become resilient. They just become fragile at scale. Signal 1. Copilot signal to relevance ratio. If over-permissioning is the hidden multiplier, we need a signal that tells us the environment is failing before a major incident occurs. One of the clearest signals I track is the Copilot signal to relevance ratio, or what I call the SSR. The idea is simple. How much of what Copilot returns is actually useful and trusted versus how much feels noisy, off-target, or structurally questionable. This ratio tells you something much deeper than whether your employees like using AI. It tells you how well your environment is organized for machine-assisted work, which is the new reality of business. Low trust in Copilot is often misread as a quality problem with the AI itself, leading managers to complain that outputs are generic or inconsistent. When adoption stalls, the conversation usually moves toward training or prompting skills, but the real problem often sits much lower in the technical stack. Messy permissions, weak labeling, and duplicate content create a landscape where old files are mixed with current ones. If the content is technically accessible but not operationally trustworthy, Copilot will ground itself on that clutter. The output is a reflection of the condition of your data estate. It is a system outcome. SSR gives leaders a practical way to observe structural quality through the lens of the user experience. If people regularly get grounded, confidence-building responses, it means the underlying environment has enough discipline to support useful synthesis. However, if people constantly see results that feel irrelevant or hard to validate, that isn't just a product adoption issue. It is evidence that your information layer is weak and failing to support the business. Once you see it this way, trust becomes a diagnostic tool rather than just emotional fluff. It becomes an operational signal. In many research contexts, a successful Copilot session rate is often pegged above 60%. While every organization has different workflows, the principle remains that if useful sessions stay low, the system underneath is telling on itself. AI value is a lagging indicator of information discipline, and if the content model is strong, the AI has something structured to work with. If the structure isn't there, you get noise, and noise has real consequences for the business. Trust drops, usage becomes shallow, and people start compensating by going back to manual searches or private knowledge hoarding. Low SSR is not just a harmless disappointment. It is the beginning of a behavioral drift that pulls people away from your systems. This makes SSR an executive metric rather than just a technical curiosity for the IT department. You can review this by role or business unit to see where Copilot feels grounded and where it feels like it's searching through a landfill with a flashlight. That comparison helps you locate structural weakness without waiting for a massive data breach to tell you where the holes are. Governance teams need to realize that if SSR is low, the answer isn't always another campaign telling people to write better prompts. Sometimes the prompt is perfect, but the environment is a mess. Better phrasing will never fix duplicated files or a weak taxonomy, and asking the user to become smarter so the architecture can stay messy is just another form of structural compensation. A better response is to trace that low relevance back to its actual causes. Is the content estate too noisy, or are the permissions simply too broad? Are there too many conflicting versions of the truth making relevance hard to establish? These are governance questions wearing an AI mask. If you want to know if your environment is becoming resilient, watch how often Copilot feels relevant enough to trust, because when the structure is sound, usefulness rises. Signal 2, blocked versus nudged actions. Output quality is a vital indicator, but it only tells half the story. The next signal is even more revealing because it shows exactly what happens when real-world work hits the wall of security controls under pressure. I'm looking at the ratio between blocked actions and nudged actions. Every data loss prevention event tells a story about where governance actually enters the workflow. The real question isn't just whether a control fired, but rather how late it fired and how much force it had to use. If your environment depends on constant hard blocks, the money and time you've invested are likely discovering risk far too late in the process. By the time a block happens, the person has already picked the file and clicked the link. They have already pasted the sensitive content or tried to hit send on that upload. A hard stop might be necessary at that stage, but structurally, it means the environment failed to shape safer behavior earlier in the journey. High block volume is often a warning sign rather than a success metric. Many leaders look at a dashboard full of frequent blocks and feel reassured that the controls are working. While a blocked high-risk action is better than a leak, constant hard stops in normal workflows suggest that the compliant path is simply too difficult for people to take. It's a system outcome. The people inside the system reach the point of violation because the upstream design isn't doing enough to simplify the safe route. Now, compare that frustrating experience with nudged actions. A nudge means the environment recognized a medium-risk move and intervened with context before the user crashed into a digital wall. The system explains the risk and redirects the user, slowing the action down just enough to create a better decision. This represents a precise governance posture rather than a weak one. A mature system knows that not every risky moment requires maximum force, as some moments just need clarity or a bit of intentional friction. The design goal is to match the response to the actual risk, without teaching your team that the governed environment is a hostile place to work. This metric is incredibly useful for identifying where governance is load-bearing in the wrong spots. When you measure blocks versus nudges by role or department, you can finally see where the safe path is arriving too late. Maybe your defaults are weak or the labels are missing entirely. Perhaps the sharing model is confusing, or the business process itself forces people into last-minute decisions without any structural support. If nudges are working well, you will see fewer collisions and much less emotional resistance from the staff. The environment starts teaching behavior with less drama because the path is already better paved for the user. That is the ultimate maturity signal. Too many blocks mean the system still relies on end-stage control, while healthy nudging means the system shapes behavior before exposure becomes likely. You still need both, of course, because some actions should be blocked every single time. But if your governance dashboard is mostly a monument to rejected actions, you shouldn't celebrate just yet. You might be looking at evidence that your architecture produces risky behavior faster than your design can prevent it. This is where the metric turns into executive language. Blocked versus nudged is a friction map that shows where the environment forces people into bad choices and unnecessary conflict. When you review your effectiveness, don't just ask how many incidents were stopped by the software. Instead, ask how many were teachable or predictable. Ask how many of those incidents should never have reached the point of hard enforcement in the first place. Resilient governance isn't measured by how often it says no, but by how often it makes a better yes possible before that no is ever needed. When people decide that even the nudged path is too much effort, a new signal appears. They leave the governed environment entirely. Signal 3, shadow ET and work around volume. That exit from the system is our third signal. Shadow ET and work around volume tell you directly whether your governed environment is serving business reality or quietly losing the argument. When people step outside the official system to get work done, it isn't random rebellion. It is comparative behavior. Users are testing two paths in real time, the governed path you provided and the unofficial path they discovered on their own. When the unofficial path keeps winning, the message is clear that the environment inside Microsoft 365 is asking for too much effort relative to the value it returns. Shadow IT is usually framed as a simple lack of discipline. We talk about unapproved apps, personal storage, or copy-pasting into external AI tools as if they are just security risks. While those risks are real, focusing only on the danger causes us to miss the design information hidden inside the behavior. Workaround volume is evidence of unmet demand. People don't root around the official environment because they enjoy violating company policy. They do it because they are just trying to finish their work. They want faster search, cleaner drafting, and simpler sharing without the confusion of the official channels. When you see rising use of external tools or private file movement, don't just ask how to suppress the behavior. You need to ask what capability gap is creating that pull in the first place. Find out what the official environment is failing to deliver at the speed or quality the business now expects. High workaround volume is a clean indicator that policy friction is still too visible to the average user. The official path feels heavy enough that people are willing to take the risk of leaving it behind. Once that happens at scale, your governance starts losing its legitimacy in a very quiet, dangerous way. The people inside the system stop expecting the governed path to help them, so they stop starting there altogether. This is a serious structural warning that your controls are no longer shaping behavior at the point of need. They are being treated as obstacles to navigate around after the real work has already moved elsewhere. To read the signal properly, you have to look for patterns rather than single anecdotes. Watch for browser-level interaction with unmanaged AI tools, or repeated downloads from governed repositories followed by local manipulation. Look for support tickets asking how to bypass sharing restrictions or recurring exports into Excel when Power BI should have handled the load. These aren't just isolated nuisances, they are behavioral clusters that show where the system is underserving reality. Governance teams need better telemetry discipline to track these support patterns and access reviews. Repeated deviation reveals exactly where your design and the actual business demand no longer line up. The executive takeaway here is quite simple. If your policies are working well, people will barely notice they exist. But if they aren't working, people will build detours. Workaround volume belongs on your maturity dashboard because it is a leading indicator of whether the official environment is earning behavioral loyalty. Work stays inside governed boundaries when that path is faster and more trusted than the alternatives. If it isn't, the business starts creating parallel infrastructure one shortcut at a time. This parallel infrastructure is expensive because it leads to duplication, a higher support burden, and fragmented knowledge. It also lowers the value of tools like Copilot because your best content is now scattered outside the governed context that AI can safely use. Shadowit isn't just a security story. It's a governance design story that tells you where the business is voting with its feet. Once you accept that reality, you can stop treating governance as a library of rules and start redesigning it as an operating model that responds to these signals. And from policy writing to system design thinking, this is where we have to pivot. If your organization is seeing a high volume of workarounds, low trust in Copilot, and constant hard blocks that stop work cold, the message is clear. Governance cannot stay in the business of writing rules and just hoping people follow them later. That old model is far too slow and abstract, and it relies way too much on individual humans making the right choice when they're under pressure. We need a different operating posture. I believe governance teams need to start thinking like system designers. And why is that? Because behavior doesn't actually happen inside a policy document. It happens inside workflows, interfaces, default settings, and permissions. If you want different outcomes, you have to change the environment where those outcomes are produced, rather than just asking people to try harder. This is the part many organizations still resist because they treat governance as a control catalog or a committee output. They see it as a series of definitions that get approved, published, and then forgotten. But none of that tells you if the right behavior is actually happening in a real-world workflow. It only tells you what the organization intended to be true. System design thinking starts somewhere else entirely. It starts with critical actions. You have to look at the specific moments where risk is actually created, like sending a file, creating a new team, or prompting Copilot with sensitive context. When someone grants access or moves data across a boundary, that is the exact moment where governance becomes real. Then you start asking better design questions. What does the person see on their screen at that moment? What is the default option, and which choice is the fastest for them to make? If they do nothing or choose the most convenient path, what happens to the data? That line of thinking changes everything because it moves governance closer to the behavior engine itself. We aren't starting with policy language and trying to force it down into reality anymore. Instead, we are starting with reality and designing controls that can actually survive contact with it. To get there, we usually need 5 shifts in how we work. First, we move from manual choices to intelligent defaults. And second, we shift from broad access to least privilege boundaries. Third, we replace generic warnings with context-aware guidance, while the fourth shift moves us from one-time rollouts to continuous adjustment. Finally, we move from relying on single-point human decisions to building redundant control layers. That is what mature design looks like. It isn't about having more rules, it's about better load distribution across the system. This is where governance teams need to reframe their identity. You are not just policy authors, you are behavior architects. You are designing the conditions where the people inside the system will either stay within trusted boundaries or start building detours around them. That is a massive responsibility because once you see governance this way, Even exception handling changes. An exception is no longer just a deviation to be documented. It is evidence that the standard path doesn't fit the business reality. Sometimes the answer is still no, but other times that exception is exposing a design gap that you should fix structurally instead of managing it politically. The same logic applies to training. Training still matters, but its role becomes much clearer. It should explain the environment and help people recognize edge cases, but it should never carry the entire burden of making the system safe. If your training is doing that much heavy lifting, your design is still underbuilt. So what does this look like in Microsoft 365? It means governance starts with business-critical workflows instead of feature inventories. You pick one workflow where the risk and the value are both high, like executive communication or financial reporting, and then you map the decision points. You look for where the sharing happens, where the classification breaks down, and where people eventually leave the governed environment. Once you see those moments clearly, the redesign becomes practical and you can convert manual judgment into labels, adaptive enforcement, and review logic. That is the real maturity move. Governance stops being documentation for audit comfort and becomes product design for business reality. Once you make that shift, another truth becomes unavoidable. Leadership can no longer delegate this quietly to IT. If governance is behavioral infrastructure, then executives aren't just approving a policy, they are sponsoring the operating model the business will actually live inside. The operating model leaders actually need. If governance is behavioral infrastructure, leadership has to stop treating it like a side document that gets signed once a year. That model belongs to a much slower era of business. The operating model leaders actually need today is continuous, cross-functional, and visibly tied to business outcomes. Microsoft 365 changes too fast, and AI amplifies too much for a static approach to work. Ordinary design drift becomes a major business risk much sooner than it used to, which means governance cannot run on a yearly review cycle. It has to run like operational maintenance, where you observe, adjust, and reinforce in a repeating loop. And why is that? The environment is alive. New features arrive every week, permissions drift over time, and Copilot introduces entirely new interaction patterns that we didn't have last year. If leadership only checks to see if a policy exists, they are trying to govern a moving target with a static question, and they will always lag behind reality. A better model starts with real ownership, distributed across the people who shape how work actually happens. IT owns the platform behavior, security owns the risk posture, and the business process owners own the lived workflow where those controls either hold or fail. Without that structure, you end up with structural ambiguity where everyone assumes someone else is monitoring the gap. That is exactly how fragility survives for years. Now, this doesn't mean you need a giant committee that talks endlessly. In fact, it means the opposite. You need a lighter operating rhythm with much better questions. A monthly cadence is usually right for this environment. It is frequent enough to catch drift before it hardens into normal behavior, but it doesn't overwhelm the schedule. During those reviews, you should look at a small set of operational signals like label coverage, permission drift, and the volume of exceptions. You don't need 20 dashboards to see the truth. You just need enough data to show whether the system is still enforcing the intent that leadership believes they approved. That is the fundamental shift. The executive question changes from "do we have a policy?" to "does the environment still produce the behavior that policy was meant to create?" That is a far more useful question that leads to better decisions. Now, a spike in blocked actions isn't just a compliance issue. It might be a sign of a workflow design failure. Low trust in Copilot isn't just an adoption problem. It's likely an information architecture issue that needs a structural fix. This is the level where leaders need to operate. They shouldn't look at symptoms in isolation, but rather at patterns across the entire operating environment. This is also where visible wins start to matter. The operating model shouldn't be judged by how many policy pages you updated this quarter. It should be judged by things busy leaders can actually feel, like fewer escalations around sharing or cleaner Copilot experiences. When work stays inside trusted boundaries because the system makes it easy, that is a sign the environment is getting stronger. Leadership trust doesn't come from hearing that a framework is comprehensive. It comes from seeing that the system is getting easier to run and harder to misuse. To make this happen, leaders need to sponsor three things very deliberately. First, they must pilot changes before a broad rollout by picking one high-value workflow and redesigning it. Second, they need to review telemetry monthly and be willing to change the environment instead of just the messaging. Third, they have to force cross-functional accountability so governance isn't trapped in a silo. That last point is critical. If security tightens controls without understanding the business workflow, friction will rise until people find a way around the rules. If the business drives for speed without any permission discipline, the exposure grows until a breach occurs. The operating model only works when those different perspectives meet in the same loop. That loop has to be sponsored from the top. If executives reward speed in one room but preach control in another, the people inside the system will always optimize for what the environment truly rewards. The leadership move here is simple, but it isn't easy. Stop asking whether your governance has been documented. Start asking whether it is being measured and adjusted like any other business critical system, because that is exactly what it is now. And once you accept that, redesigning the system stops feeling like extra compliance work and starts looking like a smart investment in resilience.